Can you hear me? Oh, excellent. Hi everyone, my name is Pierce and I'm the director of the Transnational Literature Series here at Brookline Booksmith and your host for tonight's conversation. I want to open up this space by saying thank you for coming out tonight. The Booksmith has been around since 1961 and that's because of our wonderful community. Your support means we can keep having events like this, so thank you again. As you may know, tonight's event is part of our ongoing Transnational Literature Series, which focuses on stories of migration, the intersection of politics and literature, and works in translation. If you enjoyed tonight's event, please check out our full events lineup online at brooklinebooksmith.com so you don't miss some of the amazing authors we have coming up this summer, both virtually and in store. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram for updates. Toward the end of the event, we'll leave about 15 minutes or so for an audience Q&A followed by a signing. We have copies of When the Hibiscus Falls available over at the register. And please take a moment to silence your cell phones. I think that takes care of the business end of things. Now I'd love to tell you a little bit about our guests. Tonight I have the very great honor and joy of introducing Evelina Galang and Grace Talusan to discuss and celebrate the release of Evelina's new book, When the Hibiscus Falls, a fiercely beautiful collection of stories that dwell within the complexity of family, community, and Filipino-American identity. Each story is an offering, a bloom that unfurls its petals and holds space in the sun. Evelina is the author of a previous short story collection, Her Wild American Self, 2 novels, Angel de la Luna and the Fifth Glorious Mystery, and One Tribe, and the nonfiction book, Lola's House, Filipino Women Living with War. She also edited the anthology Screaming Monkeys, Critiques of Asian American Images. She directed the creative writing program at the University of Miami from 2009 to 2019, and served as board president of the Voices of Our Nation Arts Foundation from 2018 to 2023. She lives in Miami. And tonight's moderator, Grace Talusan, is the author of The Body Papers, which won the Restless Books Prize for New Immigrant Writing and the Massachusetts Book Award in Nonfiction. Her writing has been supported by the NEA, the Fulbright, U.S. Artists, the Brother Thomas Fund, and the Massachusetts Cultural Council. She teaches in the Nonfiction Writing Program at Brown University. I'm so pleased to have them here together in conversation, and now Evelina and Grace.
So much, Pierce. Thank you to the bookstore. I love this series. I love the story of the series that you shared with me. I'm sure your people know. You tell the story.
Oh, no.
I'll tell the story. Well, anyway, so this series, this transnational series, is such an important series. I understand that it happened in 2016 when a big, bad, awful thing happened in politics. And there was a need for opening up the space to give rise and to give voice to the community that was being silenced, that was being banned, that was being made to feel like they were not citizens of this country. Right? Am I getting it right? And I'm so honored to be a part of this series because one of the things that Pierce shared with me is that the books that you bring through, the titles that you bring through are oftentimes some of the very authors who have been, who have suffered under this last political, oh gosh, why do I want to say regime? But also books and stories that are political and they're trying to make change. And I'm so honored that you feel that When the Hibiscus Falls does that. So I thought I would actually start with just opening up. I wanted to share with you so much of the stories and the stories in this book is about sisterhood, and it's about ancestry, and it's about legacy. And so, with that in mind, I had this amazing idea for the book series, the book tour, which is to be in conversation with those writers who are my literary sisters like you, Grace, who are out there doing the good work. But also with a number of my students who, my female, oftentimes Pinay, students of color, who have been writing and studying with me and who are out in the world and they are publishing and they are doing their thing. So we've been in conversation. I've been calling it the Ate Mare Sister Book Tour. So that's what we've been doing, and it's been so much fun, and the conversations have been amazing. And I also, the other thing that I've been doing is I have bringing my ancestors with me on the tour. So here is a picture of my mom's side of the family, like sometime right after World War II. And then here is a picture of my father's side of the family, the Galangs, who are from Pampanga, Macabebe. Everybody knows that from my last name. And here's another picture of them. So my ancestors are here with me tonight, and I know your ancestors are here too. Thank you for being here. So I'm going to read from the opening of Imelda's Lullaby, and it's pretty self-explanatory. Imelda lies on a cot at the foot of the old woman's bed. The aircon hums just under La Doña's snoring respirator. Across the room, the curtains blow just high enough to reveal a sliver of the moon. Imelda squints, wishes Manila were outside that window, not Miami. La Doña is thick-boned and fat and so still. Imelda rises just to check. She places her small hand on the old one's belly, lets it rest until she feels the fall and rise of La Doña's breath. Asleep like this, dead like this, there is something beautiful about the old one. The lines on her face smooth away like creases on silken sheets, and the cheekbones slope high like soft hills. The mouth, hidden under the mask, sets in its eternal pout. La Doña insists on lipstick. What if there's an emergency in the middle of the night? Y mi cara fea. Even sleeping, she is difficult, Imelda thinks. Plastic rollers and thick black bobby pins circle the old woman's face, a magnificent pink halo. Awake, the old woman's fea comes out. She screams fast Spanish, swallows her consonants, and spews bits of chewed-up food at Imelda. La Doña, widow malcriada, living at the edge of the gables, her children scattered like seed. New York, San Francisco, Chicago. Not a single one fallen close to this old tree. This vieja reminds Imelda of her auntie, Remedios, the family spinster unable to keep her nurses. They run away on her, climb the iron gates, and slip across the borders like butiki in the night. Tao yon, she once told her auntie. Why make them sleep on floors? They are help, her aunt answered. Hindi pamilya, hindi kaibigan. I pay them to work. Beds are for guests. Imelda wipes Lola Doña's brow. At least you give me a cot, she whispers. A breath escapes the old woman, deep and low like a secret. On nights like these, Imelda thinks about Manila, where it is daylight and the city is thick with traffic. There, cocks crow, and everyone wakes up to their melody. There, sunlight surrounds the houses, fills them with city noise. Back home, Imelda was the youngest of 3 daughters. Her mother taught the sisters how to direct the cook, the lavandera, the katulong who scrubbed the floors. She went to all-girl convent schools and never talked to boys, though she knew they were watching. And when she was 20, she married Armando Chin, a businessman who owned a screw factory. He was ambitious and worked long hours. He gave her a house in Makati with marble floors and terraces filled with sweet sampaguita blossoms. They raised a beautiful family. He gave her everything. I was always too nice, she thinks to herself. La Doña spits up thick mucus, and Imelda leaps to her bedside, holding the mask off the bitter face and gently washing with a damp towel. The old body seizes, then crumples up like used tissue. Leave me, China, she shouts. Espera, señora, Imelda says. Para! Her arms lift up, the hand sprawls fat and lush. The red fingernails try to dig into Imelda's light skin. Tranquila, she tells the old woman, or I will sing. Imelda holds her breath, but the sour smell of the dying soaks into her own skin. And still, she washes little rivulets of vomit that have trickled down La Doña's chin, wipes the perspiration from her own brow. Did my son call? Asked La Doña. No, señora. ¿Y mi hija? Ninguno de los dos? No, señora. La Doña might have been an old spinster. The phone in the house never rings. What do you know? La Doña says. You're not even a nurse. No, señora, I'm not, but I am still all you have. Cheap help. Your only help. Illegal help, China. Imelda ignores the insults, though her Spanish is nearly excellent. Instead, she thinks, Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us. She sings to the old woman, and that's when she sees La Doña has wet her bedding. Thank you.
Thank you so much for asking me to do this event with you. Can folks hear me? Okay, great. We've been in conversation in one way or another for maybe 15 years.
Yeah.
There used to be this Filipino-American writers listserv on Yahoo that folks were on.
The Flips listserv, yeah. We were the Flips, yeah.
Yeah, and to me it was this beginning of being included in this writing community that's been such an important part of my life as a writer. I mean, the Filipino writing community in particular. We've cheered each other on, we've told each other about opportunities,
Yep.
We've read each other's work. I don't know, it's just really wonderful to do it in person, to have this.
Thank you so much for being here tonight and for taking the time to read the work.
Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to start with something that is connected to the story that you just read and choices that you made around language. And I really loved what the writer Percival Everett said in his endorsement. Everett writes,
It's okay, thank you, figured. Everett writes, I do not speak Tagalog, but the rhythm of the language is so present here that I believe now and again while reading that I do. And I think Everett is getting across this experience of reading in other languages that is not your dominant language. And I wondered if you could talk a little about some of the choices that you make in building the fictional world.
Right. So a lot of the choices I make, almost all the choices I make, are connected to the characters and to the voices of those characters, are connected to the way I hear them speaking. So for me, as you can see in this particular story, Imelda's lullaby, Imelda's from the Philippines, and she speaks Tagalog, but she also has her Spanish because here she is living and working in Coral Gables, Miami, and she's working for a Cuban lady, a very rich old Cuban lady. And so in this particular passage that I read, actually, I can hear these two women speaking so very clearly to one another, and it's kind of that rhythm of a little bit of Spanish, a little bit of Tagalog, and English, all kind of mixed up all at once. And for me, it has so much to do about developing the voice, the intentions, and just the person of these women who are in the stories. And I always feel like that's so important. And for this reason, I think that writing in, like what I call multilingual, in more than one language, and really giving voice to characters and in the way I hear them or the way they may speak on the street is so important. You'll probably, if you read this or any of my other work, you can see that when there is Tagalog, or even in this case Spanish, nothing is translated, nothing is in italics, nothing is explained, but it's all in context.
Yes, and there's a choice not to have a glossary or a footnote,
Yeah.
And that's, to me, is part of feeling like I'm in that world.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
people can look things up.
Yes, there's also this. You don't have to know every single word that's on the page. Part of the reading experience is not always knowing what you're reading, and like having language just wash over you, and having that experience, and maybe even having like this moment, if you're a non-speaker, of entering a private space you would not otherwise have an opportunity to enter, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And so that story was also an example of this intimate moment between women, and it's a moment that we don't often see dramatized. And there's many moments like that throughout the collection of these, conversations that we have in our families between parents, and some of them are about political events that are happening. What kind of choices did you make in showing them? Were there ways that you felt like, oh, this is too intimate, or no, that's actually what fiction does?
Right. No, I think that to the best of my ability, I try to keep the critic or the editor or the one who wants to filter, the one who wants to be embarrassed out of the process. Because again, for me, it comes back to character. It comes back to, and especially in the case of my stories, which are stories that I did not get to grow up reading. I didn't have stories like this, and the stories I read were, I loved them. They inspired me to move into the world of writing, but they were never girls who looked like me, or girls who had experiences like my experiences, or girls who had to deal with a father who was super strict and wanted you to come home at curfew, And so for me, this became an important thing to be able to tell that story and to tell those stories and to be able to kind of get the conflict that we don't get to read about, we don't get to work out, right? Sometimes in real life, but sometimes, as you know, in writing, sometimes we are able to work out some of that conflict for us, internal conflict, through the writing of the work.
I'm curious about your development as a writer. So I grew up in a similar way. I didn't have any or much literature that reflected my experience, yet I still love to read.
Mm-hmm.
And so when, did families that looked like yours, were you always writing about them, or was there some kind of shift or leap that you took?
Yeah, no. So for those of you who don't know, I grew up in Wisconsin mostly, which is a place where, in the suburbs, my mom and dad were immigrants and became citizens. They met in Milwaukee, and they decided to settle there. So consequently, I grew up in a community of mostly like kids who were of German descent, of Polish descent, of Czechoslovakian. They were skis. Everyone was a ski this, a ski that, And so, and the literature I was reading did not, like I was saying, did not reflect me. So for a long time, I think I internalized that. I didn't realize that's what was going on, but I think that there was some of that that I kind of took in, and I thought to myself, these other stories are stories that people want to read, because I love the process of writing. I love getting lost in the language and just kind of being on my own. So I thought, oh, these are the stories that people want to, like about white girls. And like, how well can I do that story since, I really don't understand that perspective 1,000%, right? So I actually had a teacher pull me aside at some point, and I was already in my 20s when she pulled me aside and she said, Evelina, you've got, and she didn't actually say, write about Filipino-American experience. She said, why aren't you using the details in your life? Like the concrete details, because that's another thing that's like that helps to make language kind of live, right? Is like the specific detail. And she said, why would you use that? And I thought about that, and that's when I wrote my first story that really was a story from my heart, which was Our Fathers, which was in Her Wild American South. Yeah, so it took a minute for me to realize that my stories mattered and that other people might be interested in my stories. First, I had to care. And then after I did that, Don't you think?
Yeah, yes. I definitely had a switch too, and someone had said something to me, and it like, I didn't even realize what was happening, because I hadn't seen anything else.
Mm-hmm.
So another thing I was curious about was your relationship to activism and writing. I mean, there's the work that you did with your book, your creative nonfiction book, Lola's House, and with Comfort Women. And there are ways that the story of those women is actively suppressed, and and there's also ways that it's very difficult, as we can see in one of the short stories here, for women to talk about it. I mean, it's very difficult experience. And I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about that work, both in fiction and as an activist and as a writer.
So, I think that when I started out working on the stories of the Lolas, I would not say that I was an activist. I would not say that that was my intention when I entered that world. I was actually had been introduced to their stories through Perla Bungan and her dance, The Bamboo Women. I started to ask questions about that at the same time that my short story collection came out, and I started to hear from young Pinay and Pinoy kids, mostly from the West Coast, saying that they had never heard those stories, right? And then I was kind of curious because what I heard was the CDC did this study so long ago, like back in the early 90s or late 80s, where they said the highest rate of suicide among teenagers in San Diego was attempted suicide was among Filipina American teenage girls, so not anyone else. And then I also, I was like, what's that? And then I also then learned simultaneously this story of the Comfort Women. So I'm not going to assume everybody knows, but so Comfort Women during World War II were young women and girls who were taken, kidnapped, tricked into going with these soldiers, Japanese Imperial Army, right? And they were placed into military sex slave camps, anything 2 weeks to 2 months to 2 years, and raped repeatedly. And they were young, like as young as 8, as old as 42. And in the world, wherever the Japanese occupied during World War II, there were like 400,000 is what we're thinking, of young girls and women who were taken throughout wherever they occupied. In the Philippines, we think that there's possibly like around 1,000. So there were some Lolas that I got to meet because I was interested in this idea of what do those old women who survived this horrific war event, a crime against humanity, what do they have to teach those girls in San Diego? Because I didn't know any of those girls, but I imagine, what does it take to want to take your life? What is going on in those lives? And what could the older people tell and teach us younger women about like survival and honoring ourselves? So that was the question I had, right? So that was the question I had, and that was what I went to do. And then I got to meet these women. I met like 40 surviving Filipino comfort women, and then we were there. I was there with some of my students, my Pinay students, my Asian American students, and like around 8 weeks into, we didn't want to be disrespectful, so what we did was like we danced with them. We like drew dictionaries with them. Like we decided, we're going to go to the market, the palenque, and then we would draw like papaya and have it in Tagalog and have it in English, and these very kind of innocuous things, so that we would get to know one another. We wanted to be respectful. We didn't want to just like ask them. Well, like 8 weeks into it, I get pulled aside. They're very short. I'm very tall, as you can see. I get pulled aside, and they say, "Evelina, when are you gonna interview us? When are you gonna tell us your? When do we get to tell you our stories?" Oh, okay. So, foolishly that time around, I sat with them, and my student Ana Fe Munoz at the time was recording everything on video. She and I sat through 8 hours of just one testimony after another. Foolish. Don't ever do it. Don't try this at home. One after the other, and their stories just came into our bodies, and we cried with them, and we held them, and we like thought we were like in the clear. We could take a breath, and then the next Lola would come through. And I'll tell you something, when you hear those stories and you have your hands placed where the wounds are, where they had been traumatized, they stay with you, and it would be very difficult. It would be very difficult not to be an activist after that experience. Very difficult not to want to do something. And so what happened was, in learning their stories, I began to advocate for them. I worked in Washington, D.C., and House Resolution 121, which is the resolution that passed. Imagine this, because we can't probably think about this now. It passed the House, Congress unanimously. And it was a resolution that was asking Japan to make a formal apology to the comfort women. And even though it has never happened, when that happened, then other nations started to put out similar kinds of requests, you know, governmental, and so in some ways that became a way of documenting history. So see, even as I get away from the short stories because it's hard not to want to advocate for them. So, you know, and then Lola's house happened. That's like 20 years. And then, and you can see in this, there are only 2 stories here because I had to be really careful about like how many stories are going to be around the comfort women. But I think one of the things that, for me, I learned as a Filipina, born in the United States, I learned so much about being a strong woman from the Lolas. I learned about tenacity. I learned about what it takes to stand up and speak for yourself and to speak for one another. I learned about this practice of kapwa, you know, of community and sharing with one another. And so I think that even though some of the stories are not directly connected to them, they are very much influenced by them. They just they feed into everything I do now. See?
Wow.
Now I can't stop talking about it.
But they're also in here.
Yes.
They're here directly, and then you mentioned kapwa and also walang hiya.
Yeah, walang
which
hiya.
feels like 2 concepts woven throughout the book.
Yeah.
That maybe folks, they might not know what that is, but it's very important.
Yeah.
in both.
Yeah, so kapwa is a Filipino personhood, and it's about seeing yourself in the other. So it's very much about community, supporting one another, helping one another, and it's very interesting because I only learned about this specific term, kapwa, as an adult, as someone who's already a writer, already doing research, and kind of looking at other ways of entering my community and my culture, right? And then I see this thing, that kapwa. Well, that's the thing that my mom and dad used to do. When I was growing up, I have these, we moved around a lot, and wherever we moved, we found the other Filipinos. Oftentimes they were doctors, nurses, like that, and they were at our house, and there was always some kind of political agenda, not always go march down the street, but something as simple as finding housing for Filipino nurses in Canada. There was always something that my parents were doing, and people at our house eating and playing mahjong and playing poker, and it was constant. And I just thought, that's just my mom and dad. Well, come to find out, it's very much a part of who we are as before the conquistador, right? It's part of our indigenous selves. Yeah. And walang hiya, literally, and this is the only time I will translate literally, is no shame. No shame, walang hiya. Like when you do something and your parents are embarrassed, ay, walang hiya. Like, what were you thinking? Walang hiya ka, right?
Yeah, and to me that's a phrase that came into whether I would tell a story or not, or talk about something and bring it up or even write about it. And so I really appreciated this interview that you did with Rodlin.
Who's in the house?
Here in Electric Lit. And this, she quoted the story, "Strength is a Woman," and you writing, "No one ever gets the story right." And you wrote about how, or you talked about how, there's all these stories that get told about women and girls and folks, but we don't get to write them or tell them ourselves.
Yeah.
And for me, that's where Walahiya comes in, because I could tell something to someone and they would say, "No, that's not it." And then they would tell me what, and but wait, I'm the one that had the experience. Why are you reframing it?
Right. That gets old, does it not?
Yes, I mean, that's what drives me to write, and that's what I saw from your work as well. I mean, whether you talk about it or it's shown or dramatized in the work, it's these moments that we don't talk about, and that you're dramatizing them, these tensions between folks.
Well, I think that, in any family, in any community, there's the face that we show one another when we're in public, right? And then there's what happens when the doors are closed. And I think that very oftentimes we want to put on our best self, and so we don't share those stories that are happening behind those closed doors. But, there's a lot of trauma in family. There's a lot that goes on, and there's no way out sometimes. And so for me, so I'm just talking about myself, when I see something I don't understand, when I see something that's bubbling up inside of me, and this is from when I was a teenager with angst, right? The writing, putting it down on paper and expelling it was a way of doing that. And as my stories have come out in the world, and I oftentimes talk about, I don't really care about audience, I don't really think about audience, in the sense that I'm not writing to an audience, I'm not writing for a market. But when I start to hear the young women coming forward and saying, this is my story, or this was my story, or this happened to me, because I teach. I've been teaching now since 1993, and so I've met a lot of young women and girls, and I've lived with them and hung out with them, and there are stories there that are not being told, that are somehow not as important as some of the male stories out in the world, and don't get the same kind of examination. And for me, that's where my obsession is, my fascination is with those young women and girls. And I mean, I'm so excited because my niece is in the front row, Julia. And can I just say, Juli, I talk about you all the time in these talks because when Julia was 9 years old, there was a writer who came to your school, and I'll never forget what you told me, that they were talking about conflict, which is something that I teach, which is the thing that we look at, that I examine in the story, is the conflict, right? And it's always so hard to define it and to practice how you integrate, or how a story begins in conflict, the tension in the story. And Juli came home and said, this author said, you ask a question. Do you remember this? She has no memory of this, but it stays with her. You ask a question, the story asks a question, and when the answer is told, when you find the answer in the story, then the story is over. So for me, that's very much about these hidden stories, because there's a question how do we not do that again? In Deflowering the Sampaguita, how do we teach one another? How do we mentor to our young girls what love and sexuality is about without shaming them? How do we do that? So that's sort of where that comes from. Juli, you didn't know that I talk about you all the time telling you that. Thank you, my darling.
Well, it's amazing because that question that you asked about the statistic about young women in San Diego and making that connection, it's so much begins with a question.
Yeah, I was probably doing even before it, but I think that that for me that's really what writing has done for me. It's given me the opportunity to figure things out for myself, and because I love language and whatnot, so much, then when I get to share it, it has another life of its own. But for me, it's oftentimes figuring out, America Still Beautiful was all about that horror of the night of the election and not knowing which way the election was going to turn out. And for that character, for the older woman in that story, she was grieving the loss of her husband, who probably would have voted for the one who won. And for the young girl that was in that story, the teenager, she was horrified at the possibilities of what that would do for the immigrant experience that they were having.
What I think is incredible in your work is that there are these mentions of current political issues, and yet I don't feel it's didactic. I don't feel it's amazing. It's happening. These ideas are getting tossed around between people and characters and worked out, and so it never feels it feels very grounded in okay, the pandemic is happening. There's someone protesting with Black Lives Matter, and these are part of the stories, and yet it's part of the story. It's I don't feel preached to or anything.
Well,
it's
that's not ever my intention. I have political views, obviously you can tell. I have them, but I don't really think that those views are something that my fiction are meant to sway you one way or the other. And I oftentimes, I was just talking to another young writer who was asking me about, how do politics work in your work, and why is it that it doesn't, I never feel like you're judging your characters. But that's because I'm not judging, and also in part to be able to examine these lives of characters who may not share the same perspective, right? Who, or even that their perspectives might be in conflict with one another. I feel like I need to be able to rise above the subject matter and to just draw the picture and then let the characters handle it, because the characters will handle it. And so I was saying, I think writers just need to get out of the way. If we just get out of the way and let our characters do their thing, they're going to fight it. They're going to fight the battles and whatnot, and the story will be told without that feeling of being didactic. At least that's my hope. Yeah.
It comes back to what you were saying about listening, and you hear how the characters are speaking and in what languages they're speaking. You're listening really closely. Did you want to read a little bit more before we take questions, or what
Sure.
would you like to do?
Sure. What would you like me to read from?
I love that part in Bad Mommies, or any part of Hot
Okay.
Mommies. Sorry, Hot
Okay.
Mommies.
So hot mommies, bad mommies. No judgment there. Okay. This is so I want to say this. I don't know if anyone has. My first story collection was called Her Wild American Self, and the main character's name was Agustina in Her Wild American Self, and she was a teenager, and she was a little rebel. So she shows up in this collection as one of the hot mommies, and I think actually. And anyway, so she's 35 years old here, and this is actually the part that I'm reading has been a request by Grace, and it's a little bit of her backstory. But now I just want to say, now she's like this great photographer. She's been out in the world covering political events internationally, and she's been asked to come home after her parents have died in a car crash and take care of her her younger sister, Ginger. So here we go. After Ricardo and Mona sent 16-year-old Agustina to the Philippines, she disowned them. She was not wild. She was not bad. She just wanted to be heard. But in their old world ways, the child was to be silent, respectful, non-thinking. A child should be grateful. When trouble arose, they sent her off. A year later, they came to her, but she refused them. They stayed for a month, and she pretended like they weren't there, not even when her heart fluttered upon seeing them, not even when her mother ran her hands through Augustina's hair, not when they cradled Ginger for the first time, Ginger, who was too small to know the difference, nor when they held the baby up to Augustina to say goodbye. She ignored them. How dare they? They came and went. They took the baby. Fine. She stayed. She might have been pissed off forever had Papa not had that heart attack. She might have stayed in the Philippines, but when she got that call, she flew back. She traveled through the night and stood at the foot of his hospital bed, followed every single tube that went from his body to some machine, examined the circles under his eyes, giant bruises as if he'd been beaten up. And that's when she saw him as he truly was, a man. He was just a man. Agustina's mother held his hand. The baby, a toddler now, slept on Mama's torso, breathing with her as if they were one. Mama didn't see Agustina walk in, but when she saw her, her tears burst anew.
It's such an incredible passage. Like, there's so much in there, and the relationships are shifting and turning. It's incredible. Thank you. We have time for questions. If folks have questions or things you'd like to talk about.
My two daughters are half Filipino, and unfortunately, they do not have a girl choice next year. So it's an Anglo mom and trying to, stay connected with that part. So could you please spell out? I'd like to share some of these words with them.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm sorry, pronunciation is so hard. So if I can have it written out, I can phonetically.
Actually, yeah, so, let me see.
I know you said you didn't want to translate, but the kakwa
Yes, kakwa.
and the
Walang hiya. I was just weird. Oh my goodness, where's my little kakwa? At one of my readings, there was a young woman who came and brought me stickers that she had designed. This one is ingaka, but she brought kapwa and she brought talaga. She brought a couple other ones. So kapwa is spelled K-A-P-W-A. Am I missing an A?
Oh, that's correct.
Yeah, it's asking me to spell on the spot is like asking me to add at the cash register without a calculator. And walang hiya, no shame, W-A-L-A-N-G, A-N-G, and then hiya. Who can spell hiya? H-I-Y-A, somebody who knows. Walang hiya.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Hi.
Hi, I went to college graduated in the mid-90s. And you mentioned that you didn't have other authors to look to
Yeah.
when you were growing up.
Yeah.
And I just have to thank you because I had you.
Oh.
And you were the first Filipina I read besides the ones in Manila, like Cristina Pasohan, those folks. But
Yes.
you were here and I was here and I was like, wow, this is a writer and she's doing it. And I mean, I'm middle-aged and it's still a significant experience for me. Her Wild American Self, I think I have like 4 copies of it. I give it out, So I just wanted to thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. What's your name?
Isabel.
Isabel. Isabel. So thank you so much for that. It's true, right? Like we didn't have them before. I sometimes tell this story too, that when I was a graduate student at Colorado State, I had to for my my reading list, I had to know I had to know 75 of the master's list, all like basically dead white men, 75 of them. I had to be able to write about them. And then they asked us to do these 3 lists that were connected to our writing, and then maybe we had to know an author of study, somebody whose work we knew all their stuff. So I did like women in literature, that was easy. Then I did the immigrant experience as revealed through literature. And then I wanted to do Filipino American writers. And I had to have 10 titles. This is in 1993 is when I graduated, so a little bit earlier than that. I could not come up with 10 titles of Filipino American writers. I came up with a small handful. Ninochka Rosca, State of War, everyone read it. Jessica Hagedorn, Dog Eaters. Peter Bacho, Cebu, and Carlos Bulosa. And then I had to start to fill it out with Filipino writers because I couldn't do it. And then also, so I was born in the United States. I really wanted to have American-born writers, Pinay writers, Pinoy writers on my list. I couldn't find any. Not any. So they were all like, their experiences, as close as they were to my culture and my own upbringing, were not my experience. So I appreciate and thank you very much for saying
You're the
that.
reason that they have a voice now.
Thank you.
Blaze the trail.
Can you talk a little bit about like what role like place and setting have played as I'm reading through like when the Hibiscus Falls, I've noticed that there's never really, it really helped, but they're never really like grounded in a soft like place, or like so, which I think is actually like really helpful because I'm just like there's that hyper focus on the characters and their relationships. So, but I'm
Yes.
just curious.
Well, actually, they're very much grounded in place.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. So it depends on like the story. So when the title story happens in Miami, it's very much rooted in Miami. It's got the temperature, the feeling, the fauna of Miami, the ocean, right? So sometimes it's happening in Miami. Sometimes it happens in the Midwest. Certain stories happen in the Midwest. But for me, it's very much rooted in place, especially because these are women in the diaspora. And it's not just being in the diaspora, it's like, where are you in the diaspora? And like, how are people treating you at that moment, at that time, in that place? So time, place, cultural and societal perspective, all are very important to the stories. So, but I don't do that thing that makes all my students cringe, where I say, this story takes place in Miami. It's like you have to. It's in the specific details, and what my other niece Mia would call context clues. Yeah.
No, yeah, I think that's actually very helpful.
Thank you. Hi, Pierce.
So I know you wrote these stories over 10 years. I'd love to know how the process of collecting them went. Did you discover anything? Which one is the oldest? Which one was that last minute? I have to add this one in.
Right, okay. So Pierce is asking about the stories and how they came together as a whole, and like which one was the first maybe and which is the last. So I was working on Lola's House for almost 20 years, and I was working on a novel, Angel de la Luna and the Fifth Glorious Mystery, which was the result of that research that I was doing and asking that question, because we never made the film, but we did the story. I did the story. And it was we did the story. Me and Angel, we did the story. So I was working on these larger projects, and so I was writing these short stories in between, and when I was taking a breath, and when people were asking me to join, to submit something for an anthology or for a magazine. Do you have anything? Do you have anything? And so I would be like, oh, I'm in the middle of this larger project. But and short stories are my first love. They're like, I'm happy and I disappear into the process of writing the short story. So when I would get asked, I'd say, well, I can't really do it, but let me write a satellite story about One Tribe. So One Tribe was a novel that I was working on, and I think that actually One Tribe might be Drowning might be the oldest story from in the collection. And I said, let me see if I can write a story about this character that's not actually in the book, but she's the youngest sister of one of the main characters. So I started to give myself permission to write these short stories that were what I call satellite stories. And I would say, oh, I'm doing research. I'm doing research on the bigger project by writing these satellite stories. And then I would be having so much fun doing that. But then also, it was also my way of just kind of escaping to write the short story, because Lola's House, for example, was incredibly, when the women talk about the stories enter your bodies, they literally, like I would feel fatigue. When I got done, I did a Fulbright, and I was interviewing the women, the 16 women who show up in Lola's House over and over and over again. And I was fine because I was keeping a distance. I wasn't doing them all in a row, and I wasn't crying every single time. I was like being a tough girl. But then at the very end, the last interview, I was like vomiting and all kinds of like fever, and it all came out. So the stories really are in the body. So I would take breaks for the short stories. So one day, when my husband Chauncey and I were driving to Virginia to see his mom, I realized that I actually had enough stories for a story collection, but they were just a pile of stories. They were just like a bunch of stories that were disparate. I had written them. I think the newest story And I didn't write it in the last minute, but the newest story is When the Hibiscus Falls. Talk about that in a second. But what I did was they had these stories, and I put them together. And then what happens when you get to be an older writer and all you do is teach and read other people's work and give them feedback? Nobody gives you feedback. So I was honored to have I reached out to Kat read the collection, and like a good friend, she said, Evelina, what is the ribbon that ties these stories together? How are you going to change them from being a pile of stories into one cohesive work, like a book? So I started to read for obsessions, that's what I call them, obsessions. I started to read for different themes, and I started to see these themes coming forward: ancestry, legacy, sisterhood, like shame, strength, like because all the women are strong but in different ways, and family. I started to see those kinds of things, and also ghosts, spirits. Like, I didn't know that I was actually always writing about spirits, always. So I had to think about like how do you organize that? So like, for example, in the very first story, the old woman is grieving the loss of her husband, and she has these dreams of him, and she says, oh, I wish they were messages and not just dreams. It starts out that way, and then as the stories progress, these spirits start to enter and communicate with the characters. And the very last story in the collection then, so there's a trajectory that's like happening, and the very last story is told from an ancestor speaking to somebody, one of us here today. So there was but I had to kind of think, I had to read and see where they were, and then all the stories went through numerous revisions to get there. So When the Hibiscus Falls is the last story, because that's when I started to see, oh, these are the obsessions, and then I wrote, that was my ribbon. That's my ribbon, was hibiscus.
Stunning, thank you.
Hi.
You talked about how you're reading a lot of this stuff from I guess like I grew up in a family of like, you don't really hear that when it comes out when you're at a party, you're like, you just have a story about like things, but I feel like I really want to be more creative about it, or you
So hearing stories from your elders or something? This is how I do it. And I'll tell you how I do it, and then you figure out the best way for you to do it. I like to hang out. I like to just chill. I like to have a meal with them. And I like to not make it a big deal. Like right now, my mom is 93, and I've been having so much fun hanging out with her. And like so when my dad passed away, she gave me all the photographs in our family. And when I say all the photographs, I'm talking boxes and boxes of photos like the ones I showed you, but also my dad had every single camera from like 1950 something to like 2002, I want to say 2023, but he's not here right now. So, but like every single video camera, beta, Super 8 film, everything. So, and he was the talker in the family. So she never got to talk. So now, I take these pictures home, and Julie knows this, we take these pictures and we show them to her, and she starts telling us the story behind those pictures. Or I just hang out with her, and she's like she's been teaching us how to play mahjong. She's been teaching us, and oh my God, the scariest part is when she stands up and she walks behind you to see what your hand is, and then she says, which one are you gonna throw out? What are you gonna do? What's your strategy? Oh my God, it's so stressful, because she's so smart. But we just hang out. We cook together, or whatever, or I feed her, and then the stories start to come. Like with my mom lately, she's been saying, "Oh, I've been thinking a lot about my childhood," and she'll tell me these little things about the childhood. And then I ask, I'll ask a question or two, and then it rolls out. I mean, I think that sometimes our families, especially our mothers, are so busy trying to keep us fed, clothed, doing our homework or whatever it is, that whatever the response, and then probably are working an outside job, that telling stories of the past is probably the last thing they have energy for. So go get a pedicure together. And just hang out. Is that helpful? Cool. I hope to hear about what happens. Yeah. Hi.
So I'm just curious about your experience growing up speaking Tagalog. Did you speak it like in the house? Because I know at least in my experience, both my parents are Filipino, but they came from 2 different regions. So it's like we just spoke English, and I know a lot of my friends grew up also just speaking English, and I just want to hear about I think it's really important to try to carry on our language. It's such a beautiful language.
It
but
is a beautiful
It's hard to do
language.
when you're just living here in the U.S.
Yeah, it's so important. Well, guess what? I did not grow up speaking Tagalog, but I overheard a lot of it. One of the things, partly because I'm a writer, I think one of the best things that I do is I eavesdrop. And just like the way everything's in context in the stories, I also everything is in context the way I learned Tagalog. And my mom eventually used to say to her friends, don't speak to her because she knows everything, because I've been eavesdropping, And it's so funny because I'm going to say, so I've been reading, this is sort of an answer to your question. I have been reading Gina Postol's La Tercera, which is an amazing book. And there's so many different kinds of languages. There's Waray, there's Tagalog, there's Spanish, everything in there. And I feel and Gina will tell me in a few weeks when we're in conversation, but I feel that book is so much about acquiring language. It's so much about how we learn language, because there's the young protagonist is watching and taking notes down, and then also seeing the patterns, when certain words are being said. It's it's so funny. There's this part where it's gorilla, guerrilla, gorilla, it's and she thinks it's the same thing, and one is a gorilla and the other is a soldier. So it's but I feel that book is, and that might be something you want to take a look at, because it's so much about how we learn words and how we use them. And so for me, I was constantly eavesdropping and watching the adults. My dad and mom would speak Tagalog to each other, and that's how I learned. That's how I learned, by watching them and eavesdropping. And then my dad also speaks Kapapangan, but she doesn't, but I'd hear him on the phone, wah, wah, and so that too was about just listening. So I would say eavesdrop, and then I don't know, I mean, you're nodding your head you know what that's about. Yeah, I don't know, that's how we learn language, that's how we learn English. No, I was telling my husband, nobody sits you down when you're 2 and says, this is a verb, this is a noun, this is how you do it. We just start to mimic one another. And I feel like that's my education in Tagalog. And the Lolas will tell you that they'll go, oh, because they'll hear me talk, someone will hear me talking, oh, is your Tagalog better now? And she always, Lola knows, she'll go, magulo. Magulo pa. So it's crazy, but they understand me and I understand them. I get kicked out the translators after a while. Yeah, that was a good question.
Was there one? I thought I saw one more question.
Hi.
Hi. I love collection, and especially I love the role of mothers. I mean, thinking about drowning, about mom so long to read, and how mommies are, I'm just curious about your experiences, so much about ancestry today, generational gaps, and how, just how intentional you were with, role models.
Wow. It was accidental.
I love that.
It's purely accidental, because so much of so when I think about strong women, I think, those connections with mothers and daughters, and I think about the fights that mothers and daughters have, and I think about how it's also about cousins, and all, but then those cousins have mothers, they have crazy aunties, and so for me, since, and that's a really funny question, because I'm a stepmom, but I'm not a mom, but I'm a daughter. I'm a mentor. I have a lot of young women who I mentor. So in those ways, I feel a little bit like a mom. Oh, when I went to the Philippines and I brought the teenagers with me, and before we went, I was so cool. I was like the coolest, and they would like complain to me about their mommies. And then we went to the Philippines, and I became the boss. And then I started to say things like, I don't ever want anyone to talk to me unless they come out of my body. But I also was like, oh, I'm doing research on motherhood. So I feel like, it was completely an accident, but it's also a part of my life. So I think, really good fiction has a little bit of of your real life in it, and your really emotional experiences, and then it's got the imagination working with it and asking those questions. So I am a Lola, yes, through my oldest and middle stepdaughters, yeah. And I am an auntie, yes, and that's kind of like, yeah, yes, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys are this is a beautiful, beautiful crowd. Can I take a picture of this crowd? Or would you let me take a picture of you? You're all so beautiful.
I think it's still.
Because they're amazing. I gotta get everyone in it. How do I do that? How do I get you all in it? Wait, do I go to the center?
No, don't stand up.
I need to stand on the chair.
Don't stand up, but you stand.
I'm already tall. Oh, I can do it. But everyone's smushed together. You put it in my earth, maybe like. What do you guys together. Agua. Yeah, that's it. Okay, Grace, you should go in there. Jump in, Grace. Can you take a picture of, can you get this tall? No, I'm gonna go on the way back. That's still right. Yes, I'm gonna right next to you. Yes. Come with me, Grace. You guys are a beautiful crowd. Oh, yeah. Awesome. Wow. Professional. Should we stand? Not behind her. Oh, be careful. We know.
All right, now.
Pierce, come with us.
All right, everybody, we're doing good. Looking great. One more, and the last one. Oh, Pierce is in there. Yay! Awesome.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone so much for coming out tonight. We are going to do a signing. The signing will be over on Grace's side. So just come along and we'll get you all your signed books. And thank you so much for coming out tonight. Again.